father told me very recently. My father is an architect. He's now in his 80s. And he was telling me the story about how a few years ago he visited a leisure centre that he had designed for a pharmaceutical company, for a Finnish pharmaceutical company. And amongst those that he met and that he talked to were 5 older men who met every week to play cards. And these men, they'd all led very active, fulfilling lives, and 2 of them, if I remember correctly, they were quite well-known professors in their own time. And they'd come together for the company of something to do. So that sounds quite good. And I suspect that for these men, that loneliness actually hadn't really been an issue as such, because for most of them, they had the resources available to them, both personal and material resources, to prevent becoming lonely in the first place. The slightly unusual thing about these men was their age. 4 of them were between 100 and 104. And one of them, the youngest one, he was 97. Now, a little while later, after my father had met these, he heard that the youngest one had died, and he was replaced by his son. And the other 4 men were kind of slightly, not upset exactly, but slightly annoyed about the situation. Not because he couldn't play cards, but because he brought their average age to below 100. And I thought, well, you know, when I told this story to one of my colleagues at work, he said, well, the solution is quite simple then. You have to play cards. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But, you know, I think the moral of the story is really that there were a lot of factors at play. It was their biology, for a start. It was probably their personality, their resources, the environment that they lived in, and so on. There were lots of factors at play. There wasn't just one simple solution to why these men, were long-lived, why they had such active lives, and why loneliness really wasn't an issue for them. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mima. So with that in mind, I mean, I think for me that's a very useful mapping of the field of loneliness as it currently stands. You know, there's obviously huge amounts of work still to be done. There's lots of things happening, but there's a lot of those things need to kind of have more systematic evaluation as well. And I think that's something that means helping to generate. And I mean, the scale of this issue becomes clear in TRIL when we've compared it against health outcomes, and we found people who are who are both socially and emotionally lonely. They tend to have the worst health outcomes, and many of those that we're now following up 2 years later have died. So it's worth kind of remembering how important this element can become. And also, I mean, just in terms of the scale, it kind of occurs to me, you know, like it's estimated that last year in the UK, over 1 million people ate Christmas dinner alone. I mean, it's a huge issue, you know. So Mima's work is very important. So I think with that in mind, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Hi, thanks, Mimi. One of our greatest challenges in the TRIL study is trying to recruit people with loneliness. So what is your system for recruiting participants to studies?
Yeah, I think that's a continuous dilemma, because I think that we have a suspicion that the people we tend to recruit are the socially active, lonely people. In other words, the people who are already prepared to take a step further. I don't have a magic solution for that. I have seen some, and it depends on how long you have to recruit. I have seen some attempts where it's kind of through community networks. Because the difficulty for a researcher is that you don't necessarily get a representative sample then of the people that you want on your trial. And I think that sometimes we just have to accept that the people we identify are not necessarily the ones that are ideal. Having said that, I've seen some very good community projects. Now, these weren't research studies, but the way that they went about it was that it was kind of almost like a, okay, would you like to come to us, to our project? And the person says no, and then there's a little reminder afterwards, well, what can we do for you? And it's kind of, it's almost like saying there's something in here for you, rather than will you just be part of your study. I was really impressed actually today when I was, because I was asking that very question about, well, why do people decide to be part of your study? And there were obviously a range of reasons. I'm never convinced that that in terms of research that we reach them, because we don't have enough time. You know, some of the outreach work that I see, where people go and sit in community centres or go and sit in a neighbourhood or in a library, that might work through the networks. Actually, I've just had a thought, although I haven't tried it out yet myself, but this is something I'd really like to try, is that it's a snowballing, it's the effect, so where you actually ask someone if they know of someone else who has not come forward. And that, I know that some of the community projects use that method. It's almost like it's getting to the step behind. I haven't tried it out myself, so I don't know if that would work, but I have seen it work in community projects.
Hi, thank you. Years ago there was a stigma associated with depression, whereas in the general population now there's stigma associated with loneliness. People are reluctant to admit that they're lonely. My guess is that as you get older, that stigma doesn't matter so much. Or have you come across that reality?
I'm not so sure. I'm not absolutely sure, because on one hand, Jenny Heerveld, who says that people are quite honest about their feelings. And if you look at Heerveld's loneliness scale, she actually doesn't ask directly if you are lonely or not. And there are other scales that ask quite directly, are you lonely or are you not lonely? Personally, I have a real problem with that question, because I just think that it's almost that direct question, and you will become defensive. And I think that even as you age, because certainly what I've come across is that people worry about that question, because even though you come as a researcher and say, you know, I'm neutral, I'm perfectly okay, I'm not going to put you, the fear is that somehow they're going to be sucked into the system and be put into a home. And that, you know, there's a kind of fear of what happens if they admit to that feeling. So I think older people still have that, you know, even though might not, you know. What we do, particularly as qualitative researchers, is that we try to meet up with people over a period of time. And what then happens is that you build up trust. And that trust is more likely then to allow that kind of discussion to be held. But I am slightly worried about the very direct questions about loneliness.
I think we have time for one more question.
In many countries, there are debates about the mandatory retirement age. I was wondering if you have any insights on the role that retirement plays in loneliness experienced by older people.
There are a couple of studies that I'm aware of that have sort of touched on it, although in Maine they've looked at kind of the mental well-being rather than loneliness. But loneliness is featured in that. And I think it's early days yet, because of that change. Because of course what we're now seeing is that retirement is kind of a fluid entity, and so people can retire really from almost any age up to almost any age. So to my knowledge, but I could be wrong here, but to my knowledge, there isn't any research, and if someone knows better, please correct me, that looks at that. We actually had discussions about it in one of my research groups recently, where we said, well, this is something that perhaps we should be following up, because we're at such a time of change at the moment that is something that could become fairly relevant. So, you know, I may be wrong about this, but to my knowledge, there hasn't been any sort of in-depth research into it.
Great. Well, I believe we're going to have a wine reception after this, so anybody who'd like to talk to Professor Cattan directly, you'd be very welcome. I think it's circulating around at that point. So without further ado, thank you very much.